Hello, this is Ambivalent Offenders, and this is Jamie, and this is Aaron. And we are here for our first special series. This one, like our own, I don't know, spinoff. Spinoff isn't the right word. I put in our Patreon, even though this is going to be in our regular feed, it'll also be available on our Patreon. Basically, watch along. So, like the idea of watching or reading and then being able to have a conversation, hear our conversation, and then also be able to have a conversation written on our Patreon in our chat. Yeah, that's a good point. If you like what you've heard or if there are other things that you want to talk about with us, Jamie's set up some chats. So after this, you can go to Patreon. Again, you can join as a free member. You don't have to pay. You can go there, join us for free. And then if you want to chat about the episodes, if there are things that you want to talk about to us or just feedback, you can put there. We'd love to hear from you guys. It also is a public space too, where you can ask questions. Aaron's our wolf hog guru. So if something didn't make sense, or you're like, I wonder, is this going to come back up again? Or are most portrayals of Anne Boleyn like this? Like questions you might have, feel free to throw those in the chat as well as funny. It doesn't have to be all serious too. Just things you've noticed or things that you like about the show or whatever. If you want to talk about comparisons to the book, I've read the books, all three of them, multiple times. So I'm happy to talk book 2 as well. So I guess there starts my first question. Do they know? Are they going to make a third or no? Have they said no? Well, actually, the first season covers the first 2. The second season's going to cover just the last book. So we've got both books, Wolf Hall and Bring Out the Bodies, going to end. Spoiler. If you don't already know, it's going to end at Anne Boleyn's death. And then the second season is going to pick up with the third book, the final book, The Mirror and the Light. Oh, okay. I didn't know that. The first season covered the first 2. Yeah. So it does cover a lot in 6 episodes. And Aaron and I have watched, well, Aaron's watched them way more, but we just recently together in separate areas of the country, watched the first and second episode. So we would have, especially for me, fresh eyes because it's been, I don't know how many years. Probably right since it came out for you. So 10 years ago, most likely. Yeah, baby Jamie. She was done. She was young. I guess that's sort of my first question I wanted to know, like outside of just thinking about the history, what's your overall first impression or second impression of the first episode, just as a media entertainment? Like you don't have to go into the history, but just approaching it from just watching with fresh eyes. Yeah. I mean, I want to be clear that I did enjoy it on the first viewing. That it's not like I didn't enjoy it. It's just not the type of shows or movies that I rewatch. I'm my own weird bird where I have my own shows, Normal People, which is also not a very normal show to rewatch. But I just want to put that out there that I not that in the initial viewing that I had any problems with the show, or I was like, oh, this is boring or anything like that. Like, no, I want to set that up. I think, obviously, now that I've seen the second episode, it's hard to completely isolate just to the first, but my initial impressions, I should say, is it's a very quiet show. Like, there isn't a ton of dialogue in itself. You would almost expect it to be more like a Shakespearean entertainment with a lot of thick, heavy dialogue to have to dissect. Like really kind of be somebody who's familiar with that world to really understand it. But there isn't a ton of dialogue. The dialogue that is there, I was pulling myself back as somebody who okay, if I didn't know the history, what sets up right at the beginning with a very short title scene of where it's at. I think the one confusing part, and this might be confusing to viewers, is the time shifts. Yeah, it kind of goes back and forth. It goes back and forth between the beginning of Henry's quote unquote great matter, him and Wolsey trying to figure out a way to get him out of his first marriage with Catherine of Aragon, and then it shifts to the downfall, Wolsey's downfall. Right. So kind of goes back and forth between the beginning of that would be the 1520s to the end of the 1520s. Yeah. So it's a little, no, I say choppy, but for somebody, I think, especially if you're familiar, you'd be like, wait, what? Things are just really good. And why are now suddenly this? And then they do start having, like, if you're starting to look for it's like Wolsey's exile, it'll tell you. It'll give you I'd say that would be the hardest part as a viewer with that episode. But I think if you were approaching it with fresh eyes, if you weren't completely didn't completely know the history, but from there, I think it introduces your key players, but not too many. And you don't know too much about Cromwell. He really is this, I was just saying beforehand, and I don't want to sound like such a big literary snob or something by comparing him to like Nick Carraway from Great Gatsby, but he's this outsider in this English court, and he says some things, and we'll talk about the things he does say, but for a lot of the times he's watching. He spends a lot of the first season watching, and until the watching pays off in maybe the last 2 episodes. That is part of the large part is him taking in what's going on. He's figuring out grudges, holding on to them, and then those will pay dividends, I guess. At the end, the last 2 things I would say, impressions, is I'm kind of bringing back my 6th grade Jamie Tudor obsessed, and I always had a soft spot for Anne Boleyn. I think many people do. She's usually people who like the 6th Wife. She's usually the one. You're going to choose your favorite. She's usually the one that most people say are their favorite, and she's my favorite too. Yeah, or one of my favorites. For me, when I was in 6th grade, I was coming into that blind as a very mousy, quiet 6th grader. But I still considered myself smart and like I had wit. So the fact that she was this witty, very stubborn, which again, I was a stubborn child. Just a stubborn child. She just has that, in a way, that je ne sais quoi quality that draws you to her. Which is why people still love her centuries later. She's been dead how long? But in terms of historical figures, not even just Henry VIII's wives. If you talk about like famous historical women, she's going to be right up there at the top. Right. And again, I don't want to get into too much a tangent because this is just first impressions, but you really get this, not that you spend too much time with her, but you get to see Anne and see more of her than you do Henry at first. And then it's an interesting first meeting with Cromwell. Cromwell. Yeah. Because again, if you don't know, Anne spent much of her formative years in France and at the French court. In the book too, not just the series. It's like he talks about how she either forgets how to say things in English or more likely pretends that she forgets how to say things in English. I guess that was a question I had. Was that supposed to be kind of like a slight against him or like? I think it's I think a little bit of both. Just obviously the English and the French are, and later she says it, and we'll hear her say it in more angry, upset tones. But I think in this it's more an instance of, again, him being like, she's trying to differentiate herself among the English roses of the court, and that she's whether or not she actually has that. I mean, and people have asked, like, would she have had a French accent when she got back to the court because she was sent there, before even her teen years, like maybe 9, 10, early enough where she might have developed a French accent. But a lot of people have spent careers trying to figure out what Anne would have sounded like. So this was kind of a play on that, where she's more French than English in some ways. Yeah. And I don't want to go too much into that scene, but I do think seeing both Cromwell and Anne, who are both pretty quick-witted with the quick swipes or even just questions when he comes in saying, like, about her being busy, about her being busy. I could see how busy you are. Right. And then her saying one simple thing, I ask, am I a simple person? And he says, you maybe, I hardly know you. There's definitely this friction. There's some friction, yeah. And she's certainly, I think you described in our earlier thing, as prickly. This is definitely a prickly Anne. It's not always the most flattering. A lot of people who are huge Anne fans who love, like, I think our first introduction to Anne was Natalie Dormer and the Tudors, and that's a sexier, not that Claire Foy isn't sexy, but she's a much more sympathetic character. Yeah. This one, we have to think that this is through Cromwell's eyes, so he doesn't always have the most, he's not always coming at her in the easiest ways. So yeah, you do have to consider that. I know a lot of people who love Anne don't love Wolf Hall, both the book and the series, just because of how she's presented. Although I think we'll talk later, you do get glimpses of her. Not that you're not seeing the wit and all that, but you do see more of the reason that Henry would have fallen in love with her. But at this point, we're just seeing her with Cromwell, and she's a little bit of a snob. Yeah, and I mean, I can tell snobbish way. I see her as obviously frustrated by the situation, a little bit of a snob, but also to me, it's like she's also putting on this armor, this front. Like using her wit and her smarts. That's how she played the game, right? That's how, compared to her sister Mary, who is shown in this episode, and the next one, who, again, you might not be as familiar with her story. Maybe you are if you saw, like, the film The Other Boleyn Girl, that Mary was a mistress of Henry's prior. Anyway, I want to say my last, I guess, first impressions, because or else I'm going to just start reading from my list of things. The other thing I think that jumps out at me in that first episode, I'm going to skip over the deaths of Cromwell's family, but when we're talking about major players, like, Henry really is only there in the last few minutes. I wrote, like, really with only 4 minutes left in the first episode, do you really get to, I think that's the first time you hear him speak. You see him a little bit. Yeah, you see him a little bit before, maybe around the halfway mark, but hear him speak until right at the end. So you don't really, to me, get to see Henry VIII until right at the end, which I think is an interesting choice, and I think helps continue to push that piece of we really are through Cromwell's eyes. Like, yes, it's Anne and Henry's story, but it's really actually Cromwell's story. It's their story through his eyes and his experience. Even if we're talking about major events, I believe they show I think it's the Blackfriars court, where they're talking about Henry and they're arguing about Henry and Catherine's marriage, and that's where Catherine of Aragon has this great speech where we know that's one of her greatest set pieces, but we see it just so briefly. They're not going to linger on it for long because, again, yes, it's Cromwell's story. He is not quite as focused on that. I think his mind's on Wolsey, so he's not entirely focused on it. I think those choices are really important. There's so much Tudor media, so much Tudor books and movies and TV series that's what I think really sets it apart, is it's not just focused on those big events. Yeah, and I think it's interesting because if I was coming in blind, you do have to be an observant watcher and listener, and it might not make sense maybe on the like in a first scene, but it does build that background. Again, I think that Catherine of Aragon scene is really important of setting up with Prince Arthur, and then the old guy who makes the horrible joke about
Just
Arthur.
true.
That's a true quote, right? He's been in Spain.
Yeah.
He was in Spain. Yeah, last night I was in Spain. And that conversation of like, oh, he was a 15-year-old boy. Of course he's going to be posting about that. Anyway, those are my somewhat random pieces. I have other notes, but I know you want to get through some themes. And then at the end, we'll kind of talk about other noticings or things that we think came up. I thought, at least from the beginning, we could talk a little bit about Cardinal Wolsey because he's literally the first person we see on screen. We don't even see Henry VIII or Anne Boleyn. We see Anne in a little glimpse, but we don't hear them speak until way past the halfway point, closer to the end of the episode. And this episode and the next one, the second episode of the series, are going to be very Wolsey-centric and Wolsey-heavy. Yeah. So, yeah, I did think that would be an important place to start. He's pretty much at the center. Again, if you were coming in blind, not necessarily knowing everybody's title and things like that of importance, Wolsey, you could tell that at this point in Cromwell's life, or how in his story, like Wolsey is at the center. Yeah, if we want to talk, I think a lot of people, if you like Tudor stuff, you'll probably have watched the Showtime series, The Tudors, from 2007 when we graduated high school. Oh my God. I know, but ancient history now. But what do you remember? Do you remember much about Cardinal Wolsey and his portrayal there? He's played by Sam Neill. I was about to ask Alan Grant, Jurassic Park. I was about to say, was he played by Sam Neill? Like, for some reason, he was weird. Like, your brain is a weird thing because if you would have just asked me on the street for like $1,000 who played Cardinal Wolsey in the Tudors, I'd been like, no. But for some reason, in the setting, when have you asked it? If you don't remember, I think it's certainly, I think, a positive portrayal in there. I don't remember him. I really just remember from those early seasons, I would say the women, Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn. I haven't rewatched in a while. I just remember it was a pretty positive portrayal. I thought we could go into who Wolsey was. So just for people's background, if you're coming here and you're like, yeah, I saw the episode. I know he's really important to Cromwell. It seems like he's really important to Henry. But tell me more. So, Cardinal Wolsey. Did he have a car? He did have it. Tell me more. Did he? Yeah. He would have. But he basically runs the government, Henry's government, for many, many years, from about 1515 until his downfall, which we see at the episode, like the end of the 1520s. I think it's like 1529 is when he died. Henry came to the throne at 18. And Wolsey's like, you do all the fun stuff that you want to do as king, jousting, hunting, all that. I'll take over all the administrative work. And he does that for years and years and years. Like Cromwell, and we hear this in the series, Wolsey was born much lower than most of those circles at court that he would have found himself in. He's the son of a butcher, which we hear about in there multiple times, and it comes back. Butcher's blood, butcher's dog. Well, and it comes back in the second episode, but it does that. Yeah, I just like when Thomas Boleyn's talking to him, and he says, "Butcher's boy, butcher's dog," and then Wolsey to Cromwell, "Come out, dog." Most people of that birth, you really wouldn't have much of a chance of upward mobility. There's not really any way you can do that except for if you go into the church. And that's obviously what he does. It gives him that education. And then eventually, as your status goes higher in the church, he gets access to people like Henry and in those court circles that he wouldn't have otherwise gotten. So we
Right.
do, we
He
see
gets the
that
money.
in the money.
Love the outfit.
Yeah, the outfit. I mean, if you're looking at him historically, is he any worse than any other cleric at that time? No, but this is a time where we talked about in our Katerina Sforza episode where we got the Borgia Pope, Alexander VI. Like, they're not, they're not like the most holy of men. I'm sure they believe in things, but they're more than happy to live like great noblemen. And that's why the Reformation is coming at the side of being like, have you seen Leave, guys? Exactly. And it is, I think, an important point, though, to stress that his low birth, because we'll see it with Cromwell, too, that when they get in trouble with Henry, they don't have those friends. They don't have the people that the nobility would have grown up with. There's a lot of snobbery there. And so when they fall hard. There's nobody to help them.
Right.
They don't have those other intermarried families that like daddy's friends and stuff like that. I do think that is really important. And we will talk about Cromwell's daddy. We see that snobbery about Cromwell, and we'll see here again Thomas Boleyn. And I love the Duke of Norfolk pointing out that Wolsey's the son of a butcher, and that the Duke of Norfolk also has one of my favorite lines about Cromwell being such a person. That's my husband, that's his favorite line in all of Wolf Hall. If it were doing a fact check, I think all these would rate true. And this is where you go. You said that we wouldn't be fact checking. I think that's a big part. And I do think that Wolf Hall covers the Wolsey part and both his role in Henry's court and then his downfall pretty accurately, at least from what we can see from the history. I also thought we could talk a little bit about Cromwell's ascension to Wolsey's right-hand man. Yeah, I was curious because in the episode, he kind of just appears and he's there. Like, do you know any more about the circumstances that brought him there? He gives hints that he's been obviously in other places. He hasn't been in England for a while, things like that. Yeah, he tells his dad, I am a foreigner. Let's talk a little bit about Cromwell's background. We do know that, like in the show and the books, he is born in Putney, which by the river. It's I think it's in London, outside of London. It's just one of those small, I would say suburbs, but it's lower class area in the city. Yes. And the book actually opens with Cromwell as the child that we see. And we see the glimpses of that in this episode of him getting beat up by his father. That's where the book starts.
Really?
The famous first lines are, so now get up, which is what his father tells him as his father's kicking him. Side note, before they were about to publish the third book, the final book that appeared on billboards in London, it said, so now get up, with the Tudor Rose. And that's how people knew that there was going to be an announcement about it. So that's the famous first words. But we'll start with his dad. Was his dad this abusive piece of shit like we see in the books and in the show? Maybe. We don't know if he's violent. We know that he owned a tavern, which we see in the books. I don't think we see it in the series, but he brewed beer. We don't have a ton of records because, again, this was time. He had both time and the status. If he was the son of a duke, we might know more. But we do know that in terms of Walter Cromwell, his daddy, he is fined for watering down his beer. Not supposed to water down your beer. Ricky, I wanted a Coors Light. I would have ordered a Coors Light. Exactly. Regardless of what you wanted, he was giving you Coors Light. Cromwell later does also say to Archbishop Cranmer, who we'll see in episode 2. He doesn't appear in episode 1, but he becomes Archbishop of Canterbury later on. He admitted to Cranmer that he was a ruffian as a kid. So we do have actual record of Thomas saying, yeah, my childhood wasn't great. That's kind of what we know about his childhood. We actually don't even know the name of Thomas's mother. That's how obscure things are.
Wow.
Yeah, we think that her name's Catherine, but that's just so. Yes, I mean everybody's name was Catherine.
I was say, I'm like
Casper.
I'm like I said, Catherine, Mary, or Anne. It's just
yeah. If you made a guess, that would be most likely. But we don't even know that. So in the books and what's hinted at on screen, Thomas leaves home early in his early teens, most likely. We know he didn't go to university. He becomes educated. He's a self-taught man. He knows multiple languages, which we see in the first episode where see Chapuis and Thomas More trying to chat at each other and can't remember if it's Latin or something, and he's able to pick that up. But that's all self-taught languages, the law. Yeah, really impressive. And he spends most of his life away from court. He doesn't really get into Wolsey and Henry's orbit until his 40s, and then he only has like 10 years before he's executed. There's a lot of time prior. There is talk that maybe he was a mercenary, a hired sword. That gets mentioned in the first episode. We see the Duke of Norfolk talking about him, and he mentions that he was in the army and the Duke's, not in any English army.
Yeah.
Nope. Yeah. And it was like French, actually, to throw it back to Katerina Swartz in the book, it's mentioned that as part of the French that he's with Cesare Borgia's army.
Oh.
That is a throwback. We don't really know.
There'd be very good records.
What we do know is he ends up in an Italian banker's home, the Frescobaldis. So he worked there, and then he works as a merchant in the wool trade in the Low Countries. So that's like what modern day
Netherlands.
Belgium, Netherlands. Yep. And then he's back in England by about 1520. And then around 1524 is when he gets connected to Wolsey's household. He has his own law practice outside of that, but then he really gets connected to Wolsey around then. How he got connected to Wolsey, not quite sure, but that's when he becomes part of his household. In terms of what we know, I think the book and the show does a good job of sort of combining what we think we know about early Thomas Cromwell.
Yeah.
It's a unique experience. Again, if you look at all the other people around Henry, like eventually we'll talk about people like Norris and Brereton, and you do see in this episode, you see Charles Brandon, the Duke of Suffolk. They don't have the same experience that Cromwell has. He's got a different life experience.
Yeah, and he comes across again as that watcher, that outsider, I think, throughout the entire episode.
So he is, though, married in the episode, and he has an older son who's away, and he has 2 daughters.
Is that accurate?
That he's married, had kids. Yeah, so Liz, he was married to Liz in the books. He was working for Liz's father, and she was a widow. In those days, it was like, you combine business and personal. So we do know that that's true, and he did have 2 daughters, and then Gregory, and sadly, we know that his wife and his daughters did die of the sweating sickness. In the books and in the history, in the series, we see him die on the same day, but it was probably within that same year. But still, within a year, losing your wife and 2 of your daughters and then just being left with your son, that does a lot. And we'll see. It's actually really surprising that Thomas actually never remarries. In terms of like Thomas More, who we'll talk a little bit about, it's usually as soon as your wife dies, it's like, all right, order me another one, get me another one.
Right. Women tend to, it seems like, to be widows for longer, but men, and we get some more heirs and such. I see in your notes you have something about the sweating sickness. So what is the sweating sickness? I've heard it obviously a bunch of times, but do we know much about what it is?
No, that's the sort of the thing that makes it really mysterious is we don't really know, like, epidemiologically what it was. There's some guesses, but we actually don't know what it was. It is something that appears suddenly early in the 16th century. And then it just keeps reappearing like the plague, where it'll come, it'll go away, it'll come again, and it kills people really quickly. It's really fatal. We know, or at least we think, Henry's elder brother, Arthur, Prince Arthur, who was the one who was married to Catherine of Aragon, we think he died of the sweating sickness. At one point, Anne Boleyn has it too in her early courtship with Henry. Yeah, Henry's really terrified of disease, so he basically pieces out and is like, "Oh no, I'll see you when I see you, and hopefully you live." Yeah, she goes back to Hever and she catches it. We do talk about it in our Jane Boleyn episode.
I remember that.
Yeah, because it's a great what if in history if Anne had died. She does get really sick, as does George Boleyn, her brother, Jane Boleyn's husband. They all get the sweating sickness. We know that. That's where Mary Boleyn, the sister, her first husband, dies in this outbreak. Don't worry, we'll meet Jane and George in the series soon. We'll see Jane a little bit in episode 2, and then they'll really come to the fore in, I think, episode 3. But yeah, I wish that we knew more about what the sweating sickness was. Our friend April at Dorky Podcast, she actually did an episode on the sweating sickness as part of her spooktacular for October. So if you want to hear more about it, I do recommend that episode that she did on it. It's one of those fascinating things.
Yeah.
And then it suddenly stopped because it reoccurs throughout the 1500s and then 1551. So during Henry VIII's son Edward's reign, it just suddenly stops. It never comes back again. Like you said, it kind of wipes out Cromwell's entire family except for his son Gregory. It really becomes a household full of men. There's a bunch of young men at Austin Prize. We've got Rafe Sadler. He's going to have a really great career working for Henry, and then he works for his heirs, except for Mary, because he's Protestant and he supports her rival, Lady Jane Grey. But he actually lives into Elizabeth I's reign. Oh, nice. And then there's Richard Cromwell, Thomas's nephew.
Yeah.
So you get the sense that now it's all business. There's Gregory's there, but we'll see that Thomas doesn't have the easiest relationship with Gregory. Like he feels like he doesn't quite understand him. So that's where you leave it after Liz and the girls are dead.
You see a much softer version of Cromwell with the girls.
Mm-hmm. It's a sad thing, and I wish it wasn't real, but unfortunately, it does follow history. And again, he never remarries. He becomes a workaholic. Like many men, he focuses himself just on work. And Gregory.
I was going to ask, are there any hints that I guess it's more in, I'll save it actually for episode 2. Okay, moving away, I guess, from the men of the story, we have to, of course, talk about the main female.
And a little bit about her background here, especially her background with not Henry, but Henry Percy. So another Henry, or Harry Percy.
Yeah.
Ooh la la.
This was another part I think would be, I'm like watching it through my mom's eyes and her being like, what's that? Wait, I thought that she was with the king. I can hear mom definitely saying that. Like, is she cheating on the king?
No. Mother, listen to me. I'll tell you. I'll set you right. So yeah, this is really early in Anne Boleyn coming back from, we talked about she was in France. She comes back to the English court. We know that there's some sort of little flirtation, affair, possibly like an engagement or betrothal to Harry Percy.
That is hinted at in the show, where they're like, oh, supposedly they've gone a little bit too far.
Well, they've gone a little bit too far. Hint, wink, wink. Which means they slept together. The Percys are one of the oldest landed families. They hold the north for England against Scotland. They say that he's the man who will have to hold the north someday, so particularly right on that border with Scotland. The Percys still have the titles of the Dukes of Northumberland, so one of their main castles locations of Harry Potter, of course, location's key, holding the north against the Scots when there's a lot of trouble at those borders. That's very key. So what do you know about Harry Percy, Anne Boleyn? We do know that he wanted to marry Anne Boleyn. Again, it said that they secretly got betrothed, or in these days, if you basically said, I want to marry you, I want to marry you, and then slept together, that was kind of good enough. That was marriage, basically, because you have to think there are places that didn't have priests. So then you would do that, and then you would wait for the priest to come, and then you would make it official eventually. So we can discuss a little bit more about that later. What we do see in the show and what's true is that Anne was supposed to marry her cousin, James Butler. There's a dispute in Ireland over the Butler estate. So Anne Boleyn's father, Thomas, he's a butler. His mama has a lot of lands in Ireland, and he's feuding with a cousin. They're like, well, you're in England, I'm here. So how about I get them? So that's why you'll see in the show where Wolsey's like, marry your daughter into Ireland. That's why. That's as I would say, there's those hints where he brings up Ireland. Yeah. It was family dispute. They're like, okay, well, we'll just marry each other. And then, so then that'll solve that. Well, Anne's not a commoner. A lot of people say she's a commoner. No, she's not. Her dad is very important at court. He's the diplomat. He's a gentry. We discuss more about the Boleyns in our Jane Boleyn episode again. So if you want to know more about them, go back to that. Well, and she wouldn't have grown up in French court, so exactly. If she was like a Thomas Cromwell type, no. But she's still not a good match for Harry Percy. You're right. She's not a Percy level. Yeah, Wolsey basically laughs at that. Yeah. It's like, you think that you could marry a Percy? No, whatever it was, we know that was cut off, and most likely cut off by Wolsey interfering. And it's usually said that Anne never forgives Wolsey for interfering with this love match. She really liked Harry Percy, or like the idea of marrying Harry Percy, whichever one you want to say. But an old man in the church got in the way of my love match, I would never forgive him either. So, I'm with Anne on this one. Fair enough. She butt out. Wolsey doesn't want to butt out. In terms of the narrative, not just in Wolf Hall, but you'll see it a lot of places, that she hates Wolsey from this moment on, and that as soon as she and Henry get together, that her number one thing is to get rid of Wolsey, no matter what. And then obviously when Wolsey can't deliver the divorce, that's perfect. Great excuse. But that's the excuse right there. All right. I do think that probably contributed, but we also know that Wolsey was so used to running everything. He and Catherine of Aragon also butted heads. Well, there could only be one, and Wolsey won out there. And, Anne was not going to let that happen. She also wanted to be top dog, if you will, with Henry. She wanted to have his ear. And Wolsey wouldn't have allowed it. So they couldn't both have Henry's ear. So that's kind of where we're at. And we will see Harry Percy later. So I think we can kind of pause there in terms of talking about that, because this is going to come up again. If you're thinking about, and especially if they are possibly betrothed or even married, that's going to be a problem. If you're thinking about in terms of how it portrays it, if you're going with the true or false, I think pretty much true. This is portrayal. I don't really know what's going on in Anne's psychology and in her head, but I do. Like you said, I would be pissed if this whole old cardinal came up and said that I couldn't marry this hot young guy who I loved, who also had giant castles and great estates. Right. It's definitely, especially for somebody as stubborn as Anne, and maybe someone who's likely to hold a little bit of a grudge. Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. We know a girl could hold a grudge. So I do think that I can sympathize. I can sympathize. The other topic that I wanted to cover was, which we won't go hugely into depth, but we're going to see our first glimpse of Thomas More, who is going to be very important for the rest of the season and at this point in Henry's reign, and especially in the second episode when he's carrying rabbit.
I'm just gonna leave it there. Well, no,
No,
gonna
sorry.
spoil
We'll
it.
cut it out. We'll cut it out. We'll cut it out.
Bleep it.
They're going to
Yeah.
think that it's going to be something inappropriate if we bleep it. If he's carrying
Yeah,
up.
then we're breaking things.
They'll just be surprised. We do get to see our first glimpse of Moore, and we see the rivalry that he has with Wolsey. Not a fan. And then
No.
a little bit of that friction with Cromwell, which again will carry out through the rest of the season. He seems just a little prickly, nothing over the top, but it doesn't seem like, he necessarily gets along with either of them. No. And if you know or read anything about Wolf Hall in general, you know that the biggest takeaway from it was the creating of Cromwell in this more sympathetic light, which he's usually not seen in. He's usually seen as like the arch villain. Again, if we go back to the Tudors, I haven't watched in a while, but he is seen in that villainous light, eventually taking down Anne Boleyn, very out for himself. And then Thomas More, he's a saint. He's a literal saint. There's that from the 1960s. There's a play and the movie A Man for All Seasons. Like very principled Thomas More. Wolf Hall kind of flips that all on the head. You're a little bit more sympathetic to Cromwell, and Thomas More becomes that much more unsympathetic, a little bit of a hypocrite. We'll see. A little bit of a slippery creature. At this point, seems just a little eccentric. Yeah, a little eccentric. Especially in the second episode. And the problem with what he says to Alice. Well, I know. And that's the thing. I'm sure that the real Thomas More is somewhere in the middle, as usual. Right. I'm sure that it's... I mean, he's not portrayed as a monster, right? He's just not. He's just more. Well, we'll see later on. We'll see him, like, torturing heretics. So you'll see a little bit. Maybe not the monster. Catholics like that. Probably. Yeah, the uber Catholic. I do think it is a very interesting portrayal because, again, it's not the saintly, A Man for All Seasons. I'm trying to think of a comparison, like a good comparison, like almost like one of our, I want to say like one of our founding fathers, but in that sort of like very old school. He has real personal problems with Henry's divorce. Could have been Thomas Jefferson. How we think of him being all torn up over, with slavery and all that. Yeah. And also Thomas Jefferson and Hamilton. Two very different portrayals. Yes. There's not really any other media that's ever really portrayed, at least that I will say I haven't ingested all of them, but I do indulge in a lot of Tudor media, but he's never really seen. And you want to admit that on your indulgences. That is my indulgences. Don't worry, I pay for them. It's just it flips everything on its head. Cromwell's the protagonist, Moore's in some ways the villain. What we know about him in real life, he did have some things that weren't so great about him. He thought about actually being a priest early on, but he was too interested in secular pleasures, wink, wink. He knew he couldn't not fuck, wanted to fuck, so he was like, okay, I'm going to have to do it. So he marries, and when his first wife dies, he marries. Guess how? Oh, you haven't read my notes, have you? Are you looking at them? Okay. How quick do you think he marries after his first wife dies? Just take a guess. A month. Yeah, okay, you do. You did read them. That's why I actually didn't. He remarries within a month, which is that's really quick. Really quick. You have to get special permission to do that, which he marries the rich widow Alice, who we'd see in the second episode. She's a little bit older than him. Basically, he just wants somebody to take care of his kids. And he's kind of indifferent to her. I'm just going to make a joke. As a single mom,
dating. You're like, I get it. You get it. You're like, isn't that like a lot of guys out there who have,
Oh, yeah,
I'm sure, who are dating, not my boyfriend, nor other men I've dated. The stereotype.
it is that they want a mommy to take care of
Right.
kids, and
And I have these children. How do I feed them? How do I feed myself? How do I
Yeah.
do laundry?
to be fair, if we're going to say good things about Thomas, he was really into education, even for his daughters, like Margaret, who we do see in the second episode, and we will see her also later in the season. He educates her in languages. She knows Greek. That's very impressive. At least him believing in educating women is good. And he kind of starts the quote unquote trend of educating your women, or your daughter, which is why like people like Elizabeth and future Elizabeth I, they educated in a higher fashion than women did decades and centuries before. So good for him there. We're going to talk about Thomas More's downfall, but we're setting up that tension between the old guard, the people that Henry knew before. We've got Wolsey, you've got More. More represents that more conservative faction at court. And they're not fans of Wolsey. And then they're not fans of Cromwell after Wolsey falls. And they don't really love that the king's replacing Catherine of Aragon with Anne Boleyn. Thomas More is going to be at the center of that, if you know anything about the history. And we'll cover that.
They hint at that or say it outright. They can't remember. I feel like Wolsey's the one who says it. Or maybe it is Cromwell. There's a comment about like with More, and they say how
because he's going to be chancellor, but he's not.
Yeah. Cromwell takes the guess. Oh, it'll be Thomas More. Like he's opposed to the marriage, but he'll accept the position,
which again is sort of feeding into that. Thomas More, he's not doing it out of the goodness of his heart. He wants to be chancellor. He wants to be top dog. Let's dispense with the saintly thing. I don't think you could even say that he's trying to save Henry from himself. No, he wants to be. Chancellor is basically the head of the government. He wants to be that because,
with that, then I guess in that same case, why is he so against? I mean, is it a spoiler if I say, he's sainted, so people probably can guess that he's martyred. If he's so enthralled with the title of being chancellor, then why not just go along with Henry's thing? Or was he just that uber religious?
I think part of it is being religious, and the idea of moving away from Rome is a lot to ask from him. But this isn't a cop-out, but we really talk about it because Cromwell talks later. He will pose it to Thomas about why can't you just admit it? They're just words, just say it. So there will be a conversation around that. So we'll pick that up when we get there.
That sounds fair.
I'll allow it. It's planting seeds about this idea, not only about the Anne Boleyn versus Catherine of Aragon, the changing of the guards, but we also see the hints of, we've got some hints of the new religion, and Cromwell's right in there with it. He gets Tyndale's Bible in English, so William Tyndale's part of that Reformation, although actually Tyndale's, I don't think he was a fan of Henry's divorce, so he's one of those weird ones.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he's one of those weird ones. I think same with Luther, I want to say. Feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but I know Cromwell at some point said they could win fans of Henry if they just gave in and said, I'm okay with the divorce, but they don't. That's just them being stubborn. They could have made, if not friends, but they could have made friendly with Henry if people like Tyndale had played nice. Tyndale translates the Bible into English, and later he'd be hunted down for years and years and years. He's on the run until he's finally found and burned at the stake. But I think that'll be in the second season. It'll take a while.
They mention his name,
and we'll see that later, reading the Bible in English, which it's so hard because if you're watching this blind, I remember watching it with like dad, our father, bless his soul. He's not dead, but our father, our father who art in heaven. No, not our spiritual father, our actual father, our earthly father, who's also not dead, but bless his soul in the fact that he has watched Wolf Hall with me more than anyone else in my life. I think if there are world records, Aaron has watched it the most, and then my father, yes, because not because he's a history buff. Yeah. I mean, he likes history, but it's not like he's a big fan of Tudor history. But no, he's just there. The problem is he loves his daughters too much. Yeah, so he knows. Although it's funny because he'll pretend that he doesn't really know what's going on. Like I remember watching The Hollow Crown, which is the adaptations of the Shakespeare history play. Watched it. Yeah, but I remember him being like, I don't really know what's going on. But then he would spout out a perfect summary of what was happening. And I'm like, you got it. You're acting like you don't understand what's going on, but you 100% know. You're like, yay, my student. I know. A+ clearance. I'm so proud. I am proud. If you were somebody like that, you'd be like, well, okay, what's the deal? Who cares about the Bible being translated into English? Well, if you're with the Catholic Church, it's Latin. The ceremonies are in Latin. We'll see that become even bigger problem later. There will be some trials, and some of Cromwell's more heretical friends will be found out. So we can cover more of that into detail, but you do see us planting that Cromwell's on the side of new religion, Protestantism, and that's why he's going to be driving the Reformation once we get there. Right. And that's, I guess, one of the not only things, but I feel like when you're in high school and stuff learning about the Reformation and Martin Luther, it's like the Bible in the vernacular, the Bible in the vernacular, the word of the people. Which is important. He does say when you get the Bible, Tyndale's Bible, and he tells his wife, you can read it. Yeah. This is important because, gay people, probably 98% of the country would not know Latin. Right. Yeah, especially women. Yeah. So to quote our current president, Joe Biden, that's a big fucking deal. Those are kind of the main things that I pulled out to talk about in the first episode. We did highlight that we've seen a brief appearance, cameo of Mark Smeaton, the musician, who we will talk about later. You better believe it. To clarify, the historical cameo, not like an actor. So if you're looking up Mark Smeaton, the musician, if you know anything about the time period, then the name will not surprise you. He's brought up a few times, I feel, in the first few episodes. Yep. And then we also see people like Richard Cromwell. Just a fun fact, Richard, who's Cromwell's nephew, who we see take on his last name. So that's kind of a sweet scene. I was like, oh, yeah, because his father's dad is the son of Cromwell's sister. If you read the book, then they go into more depth about Cromwell's sister and his family, because he still keeps in touch with them. The sister comes and tells Liz about Walter Cromwell. We talked a little bit about his dad, but not too much, just about the historical stuff. Richard Cromwell, he's the one who, if you know the other Cromwell, Oliver Cromwell, who was famous during the English Civil Wars, it's through him. It's his line that Oliver Cromwell comes from. So that's a fun fact, because I know a lot of people get confused with Oliver and Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell. What else did you have to talk about? These are my very elegant notes. Since podcasting is not a visual medium, just know that it's on my phone of just random quotes. I heard in a way it's similar to when I observe like a classroom and I'll type out quotes I hear or things, or just random thoughts. So I started with the very title card. The last title card says, Henry is not a forgiving man. And I was like, that's one way to put it. So I wanted to make clear of that. That's not the last bitchy title card. But whoever was writing the title cards, chef's kiss. We love you. And
about Wolsey saying about Cromwell, a man born in a more lowly state than myself.
Gets very excited.
I liked Liz had a little snarky comment with her. The smallest compliment a woman could ever receive.
Yeah, is that she's better to look at than the cardinal.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
That's the smallest compliment a woman could receive. Yeah, right.
Mm-hmm. Wolsey creeping and thinking about young Catherine of Aragon and Arthur dancing.
Well,
naughty thoughts.
Well, she was very attractive. Even when she married Henry, she was
Wolsey,
20s.
The man of the church.
Well, he has illegitimate kids, so.
Suffer. The rumors when they were talking about how the emperor has the pope and talking about eating babies and all that.
Yeah.
Shit.
Yeah, we didn't even talk about.
Which obviously happened.
That's true.
People eating babies.
No. As Cromwell said, they're too busy looting or stealing to eat babies.
Yeah. Right. That key piece of the emperor being Catherine's nephew, it's going to make things a little awkward with the Pope. For flat-chested women out there, I would like to just say the comments about Anne being flat-chested. They said how Mary moved from Mary to Anne, flat-chested sister. Yeah, it was like, excuse me, we have feelings too.
I mean, part of it was that when we talk about Wolsey and rivalry sort of thing, nobody would have ever expected that she would have been as long-lived or that she would overthrow Catherine, that she would become queen.
Right. He had mistresses
before, so he has, before this, Mary Boleyn, and then even before that, pretty early in his reign, is Bessie Blount, who gives birth to his illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy. So it's not that this is the first time he had a mistress. There's no reason that they would have thought that this one would stick.
Right. But the comment about Mary, I was like, Mary telling Thomas about how they haven't had sex, but he'll pull down the shift and kiss her breasts. And again, there's some Thomas saying,
God's help her.
Can you help
him if you can find them or something?
To find them, yeah. Like I said, with about 4 minutes left, I get to see Henry and really hear Henry for the first time. And he does get mad. He gets into kind of stirred up. He's like, you told me I couldn't lead my own troops. Well, basically, stay indoors like a sick girl. And he said, your reputation is bad.
That's the Cromwell.
True. Yeah. Cromwell says, like, Your Majesty can form your own opinions. And there's another, I think, a good visual moment when they have the seal or the family crest of Wolsey. They ask Cromwell about it. He says about painting it brighter.
Actually, Cromwell's, his eventual, family crest, seal will incorporate parts of Wolsey. So that's how also we know that he remembers Wolsey. Again, looking back at historically, we're making assumptions based off of actions, and between that and other ways that he honors Wolsey, that's how we think that he cared much about the cardinal, which we'll see in the series. Right. I think those are some good moments. We talked a little bit about just fun things. Like we'll see some more antagonism between Cromwell and the Duke of Norfolk. I love him, and I'm so sad because the actor died last year, so he's replaced in the second season. The Duke of Norfolk is a real son of a bitch. Historically, nobody likes him. He's horrible. Placing it in terms of family relations, he's Anne Boleyn's mom's brother, so he's her uncle, and he's also the uncle of future Queen Catherine Howard. He also treats his wife horribly. Cromwell becomes a sort of a marriage counselor for multiple high-end marriages. People write to him. The Duke of Norfolk's wife writes to him because he treats her horrible and he shacks up with a mistress. He's not a good guy, but I do love the portrayal of him and Cromwell going back and forth again, calling him a person, and then them fighting about England and France fighting, and that we have to do it because we're English, and that he wouldn't expect somebody like Wolsey and Wolsey done because he's of a low birth. We'll see more of the tension, and again, spoiler later, the Duke helps take down Thomas Cromwell. Not in the season. That'll be future season 2, but that relationship never really gets better. Go figure. He's very much a snob in terms of always seeing Cromwell as lower, like Wolsey. Or is there anything
Unsurprising.
anything else you want to talk about? What about performances? We've got to give it up to the man, the myth, the legend, the love of my life.
Course.
Sorry, Matthew. The love of my life, who I've never met. Mark Rylance and Cromwell, so good.
I know, of course. I was going to say, I'm surprised there hasn't been any.
I know, that's what we had to
There
pull.
wasn't enough swooning for me.
No. That's why I had to bring it at the end. It was just small details, like at the beginning when Norfolk and Suffolk come to arrest Wolsey. There's a moment where Cromwell's looking at them, and it was just like this little moment that, unless you're looking, you might not see, but like just the sniff that he does. It says so much. This Cromwell is a brawler. If you read the books, and there'll be hints at it later, you'll see why they say he leaves home. The trouble, maybe a brawl that went a little bit too far. I don't want to say a violent man, but a man who uses his body to fight from time to time.
Wow.
He embodies Cromwell, and we only see glimpses of Damian Lewis as Henry VIII, but we'll see more as we get on into the later episodes. He's also gives a different Henry, I think, than we've seen before. It's interesting because he doesn't have like the brawn of Henry that you're used to, at least in this. I don't want to say too much because most people will have seen this first episode, so I don't want to go too far. But yeah. But just the little glimpses at the end that we get of him is tantalizing. It's a great performance. I think they're both standouts, and obviously Claire Foy is this version of Anne Boleyn. She plays it also perfectly. We'll talk more about her later. Oh, and then I think Jonathan Pryce as Wolsey. You do see that brief anger towards Thomas Boleyn with the Harry Percy saga. You do see some of that more angry Wolsey, the Wolsey that ruled the administration, ruling that for 10, 15 years, about 15 years. You kind of have to be, you can't be a pushover. So you get to see some of that. Not
very, very dismissive of like, no, that's not going to happen.
So you do see that. It's not a wholly, quote unquote, positive, or at least you see that a little bit of the edge. I think he really embodies the Wolsey and him and Cromwell's relationship, that like a paternal role. The dad that Cromwell never had. Wolsey sort of steps in and is in that paternal role. Jonathan Pryce, obviously, he's a wonderful actor. You've probably seen him in Game of Thrones and some other things, and he's great at that. He'll steal the show in episode 2, so we'll talk more about it then.
Yeah, that's a very Wolsey show.
Fun. All right, that's pretty much what we have on our end. So, I'll play 2 reminders. First, you'll see this episode both on the Patreon page and in your regular feed. But starting with episode 2, it will be just on the Patreon feed. But if you are still interested in listening and following along with us, again, don't fret. You can join as a free member this month of November. And hint, coming up, we're going to have a special for December. I'm not going to say much yet, but we'll have another little special going on. So don't feel like you can't join us over on Patreon from starting on episode 2. And then also after we publish this episode, we will put up in the chat on Patreon just to chat about this episode. So it can be serious questions you have, things you might have noticed that we didn't bring up, things we did bring up that you want to explore further, or even just ridiculous things like
in the next episode with more carrying a beanie. Again, we can't say it.
That is
Keep it
so
secret.
one of my favorite. That's just one of my favorite details in the whole show. I can't wait to talk about it.
We're very excited for me to see it.
I was like, I know you're going to comment on it.
And I did. I did right. I did. And then I said, why all the animals?
Well, it's cute. It's cute. We like it. No. Thanks for joining us. Hopefully you guys enjoyed some of our commentary. If not, tell us. Tell me. Tell us. You could tell me what more you want from me, because
What do you want?
What do you want? Well, if anybody knows me, Wolf Hall is a big love of my life. The books, the show.
Mhm.
So if there are other things that you want me to talk about, please let me know. I'll do whatever.
I'll do a private session. I'll talk.
I will.
3
I mean, I
hours
could.
about it.
I could and have. My husband has heard it, and he's heard me give private lectures for multiple hours, whether or not he's asked for them. And that's what I get now, too.
We'll probably have episode 2, I'm guessing pretty soon, because we both have watched it. So we just have to react. Keep an eye on Instagram and your Patreon page, and you'll see episode 2. And then, of course, Sunday will be our regular programming. We've got John Brown.
Yeah.
Martyr or terrorist. Well, you will start to decide, but we're not going to talk about it until we hear the other dueling villain, Aaron. From Aaron. Fitting. So
Yeah, I didn't even think of that. I'm like, Aaron chose Aaron. Didn't even think about that. All right. Cool.
Yeah.
Bye, guys.
Bye, everybody.